Hey, it's me, Tim, and I'm actually going to do a voiceover on this video, which I don't usually do, but I feel like there's enough to talk about that's going on here. And I want to tell you about some of the things that went wrong as well. But first off, this video is sponsored by Vectric, so that's why I'm showing some of the Vectric modeling that I did here, and I'm going to explain it a little bit for people who are CNC curious. If you're not, you can fast forward about a minute. So basically, it's two pieces that I had to cut to make this instrument. Starting with the fingerboard, which is aluminum, it's a basic 3D carve. I made a radius by creating a circle and cutting off a little bit of it and then doing a 2-reel sweep up. That just means I created a line on either side of the fingerboard and then I applied my radius to the line, and then the computer calculated out and added that curve to the whole fingerboard. Then I thought it would be cool to add a 0 fret right into the file, so I just raised the aluminum a little bit at the end by just creating an object that went up for the strings to go over, and there you can see the whole file is done. I also added some engravings to it, which you'll see a little later. The body was modeled in 2 parts. I did a 2-reel sweep on the neck in like the similar way as the fingerboard, but it's a different radius, of course. And then I created the body by just creating a shape from the vector. And you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, you can adjust the angle of the shape and the height. And I kind of squashed it back down to make it flat and fit it into my block until I got something that I thought looked like what I wanted. Tools today provided all of the router bits and cutters that I used in this video, as well as this 80-tooth Mamba table saw blade, which is designed specifically for cutting plastic. Now, I was having a little fun at the beginning of the video, but I want to thank Paul Jackman for scoring this piece of plastic for me. He was a reclaim center near him in Washington, D.C., and they had a couple pieces of this. He got one for himself and one for me for a really good price. Apparently it was used as bulletproof glass on the TV show House of Cards in filming. Cutting acrylic is messy, and all those little pieces coming at you are a little bit sharp and a little bit warm sometimes. But it's really neat. Like, I love seeing the drill bit go through it and the cuts go through it. It's very interesting to work with. I had to make sure my block was like perfectly lined up, because otherwise my base might not fit if it was a little crooked. I started with this 1/4-inch end mill. All the bit information is in the description of the video. There'll be links if you want to check them out. I don't have one of those little metal plates for setting my bits, so I just use a piece of paper to make sure it's nice. And it's time to cut. Again, I love watching the acrylic cut. I left the dust shield off. But check this out. This is how fast I was actually running the bit, and how nice of a cut it was giving me. It was pretty exciting. That's pretty quick. Cutting the top is really straightforward. I just have a slot for my truss rod. I put a slight recess in it for the bridge to sit a little bit lower. And then my buddy over at Gemini Pickups rewired an old made in Japan pickup that he had laying around for me. That's super cool and exciting, so I had to make a pocket for that. I also put a couple guide holes into the plexiglass and then mirrored them and put them into my wasteboard. They're just 0.3 inches wide, and a pencil fits right in there. So this creates a little tab, so when I flip my piece over and I put it back down onto the wasteboard, I know it's exactly lined up where it should be. Otherwise it just won't line up with these holes. They're not even or centered. They're all just random. This 1/2-inch single flute cutter was exciting to fire up. I stepped back for the first time in my history of owning a CNC when I heard it fire up. It's loud, and it sounds like a helicopter taking off or something, but it did amazing work at quickly and efficiently clearing plexiglass away as I did my rough pass on the backside before I did my final carve. You can see the mess it made. I used a 1/4-inch ball nose to do the final 3D carving. Now here's a little trick. Because the top side of this instrument is flat, usually when you do a 3D carve, you'll go all the way past the edges and all the way down around the edges of your item, and then it goes right down to the wasteboard to cut it all the way out. I didn't want to do that, as you can see, like on the left-hand side of the neck there, because then my piece would come loose and I had to do more tab work or more gluing work. So instead, I just went right inside the file of the body, but then for the neck I went a little bit wider, so that way the body stays in the block until I cut it out with this 1/4-inch end mill, but the neck gets its whole profile completed all the way around to the wasteboard. I just realized I skipped a file. I forgot to cut out my cavity that goes here for the electronics, but fortunately when I cut my final profile out, I went into the wasteboard just about 1/100th of an inch so I can line my instrument up into this groove that's here. I can line up my tabs that are there and everything, and go ahead and hold this down and then cut my pocket. I used some thin strips of hollow core door, of course, and a couple blocks of wood to just secure it in place. Now it's time for the aluminum fingerboard. I used my square, still available at timsway.net/sqwayre, to clean off my wasteboard a little bit and make it nice and even. And then you can see I put a lot of tape and wax paper on the board to try to help keep the mess down, because I'm going to be spraying lubricant on the oil as it's cut. Did the typical masking tape and super glue trick, and I glued this piece of 3011 1/4" aluminum right to my wasteboard. I'm not removing a lot of material, so I didn't need to do like a roughing pass first. I went right into a special metal cutting 1/4" ball nose and started cutting out my profile. It took a while. I had the CNC running pretty slow, and I slowed the motor down a little bit on the router, and as you can see, I'm keeping it pretty well lubricated and cooled. I babysat it for the most part while it cut. It's like a murder scene. Each one of these shards is like a tiny razor blade that just wants to get stuck to your arm or in your sock. So we're going to try and clean this up before we move on. I also ran that toolpath again, but going vertically instead of horizontally, because I thought it would give me a cleaner finish, which it did. I carved some position markers and this armadillo into the fingerboard as well, with the 30-degree V-bit at 0.01 inches depth, and it worked out really well. If you didn't already know this, it's a simple click. You can apply images and carvings right to the radius and right to your model by just clicking apply it to the model in the toolpath, and you don't have to worry about it. It all goes in the same depth around the arches and everything. And then I had to cut the fingerboard out, of course, with a 1/4" end mill that was designed for cutting aluminum. I used some black Starbond CA glue to infill all of those little carvings that I did, and this is superb for making very complex inlays very easy. I just filled them with CA glue, sprayed it to cure, and then sanded it off, and it looks like a million hours worth of work that's just easy. Oh yeah, that's awesome. You can ask me why there's an armadillo in the fingerboard, and I'd love to tell you, but I really don't know. I just popped in my head that I wanted an armadillo there. So I polished the aluminum up, and it came out pretty good. I have to tell you, this project was so exciting for me because I've wanted to make an instrument with zero wood for a while, and then when Paul dug up that thick block of acrylic, I was like, oh yeah, this is it. And so there was, you know, it's not that I was necessarily into the acrylic, I was into the idea of making the instrument without using any wood. And there's all these things I learned about the acrylic in the process, like that edge I had to round over, because if I left it 90 off the CNC, it was so sharp I literally cut myself on it. And then again, I love watching the drill bits go through the clear plastic. It's so cool. There were a few spots I had to clean up by hand too. And then there was obviously a lot of sanding to polish. Yes, I put a truss rod in, and yes, it does work. I'll talk a little bit more about the neck and what I did wrong later in the video. But what I did do is I took that blue paper off the truss rod, cleaned it up, and wrapped it with clear tape so it would just be metal. I wanted everything to just be clear or metal. I hemmed and hawed about whether epoxy would be enough to just stick these two pieces together, and I decided I would just try it because it would be the cleanest and simplest look. And it is and was strong enough to hold it for the most part. But so now that I had it all together, it's like time to polish up the acrylic, and I just wet sanded up through the grits up to about 2,000 grit before I went to the secret trick for polishing acrylic, which is fire. But I had a lot of sanding to do first. There's a trick and a skill to this which I have yet to grasp, but I started learning a lot by doing this. You want to heat the plastic up and basically just melt the top surface so it gets clear, but if you get too close, it'll actually ignite and catch on fire and get cloudy, and then you have to do it all over again in that area, or potentially sand if it really catches on fire. So there's a speed and a distance to the flame that needs to be consistent. Flame polishing the neck was the biggest concern I had for a couple reasons, and everything that I thought might go wrong did. I was mildly concerned about this, but not enough to stop. As I was heating this up, it actually heated up my epoxy, and this neck has bent a little bit from the heat. It sort of curled up. So I'm going to need to re-epoxy this, which is kind of okay because I was trying to get the epoxy as consistent as possible so you wouldn't see these bubbles, and you could. So now that it's off, what I can do is clean this all up. You know, my neck is basically as polished as I'm going to get it, so I don't have to worry about heating this area up again, and I can re-glue, and I should be okay. It's always difficult to adhere two smooth, shiny surfaces together because there's not enough porous space for the glue to sort of mix in and interact. So I'm roughing it up a little bit this time with some 80 grit sandpaper to hopefully get some better adhesion, but it should still look, you know, shiny enough if I do it evenly. I know you're in suspense, so I'll save you the wait. Yep, it came off again while I was doing this. I decided the fingerboard needed some screws to keep it in place, and I almost did this on my CNC file and created perfectly artistically recessed screw holes, but I didn't want to just give up before I tried. I ended up doing them by hand, and so I had to sort of do them where I could. They didn't come out great because I was drilling into a radius surface, so I'm not super happy with that. But the other thing I did is I hung that weight from the neck with the fingerboard off, and I repolished it. And I did this a little bit back and forth to sort of get that bend out of the neck to make it flat and true again before I glued the fingerboard on and screwed it on. It came out pretty good, but there is a bit of a bow now in the middle of the neck that I couldn't quite get out, and the truss rod actually worked and helped get some of it out, but I'm not really happy with the way the neck is set up. This is just a piece of aluminum flashing that you would use around your chimney, and I cut out a little plate to put inside the cavity to act as a ground shield, and I also cut out of some 1/8 inch plexiglass a back cavity cover so that would be clear. I was pretty unhappy with the fingerboard and neck issues that I had, and then when I put those screws in, it chipped the plastic a little in the neck, which kind of bummed me out, so I got to the point where I stopped obsessing about polishing and just put it together to play it. Oh, there you are. This, like almost everything else that I make around here, for the most part is a prototype, and I learned a ton doing it. This was my first time really trying to do any kind of serious acrylic polishing. I did make one other acrylic guitar in preparation for this, where I had just the sides to polish. This was a little bit more complicated, and the finish isn't perfect on it, but I learned a lot, and I will do better next time. Most importantly, what I'll do next time is I'll make sure I clamp this neck down to something rigid while I flame polish it so it doesn't move on me. I would probably require several steps and clamping it in several places and whatnot to make that happen. And the other thing I would do differently if I did this again is I would create and pre-drill these holes to hold the screws into the fingerboard, and I would do them like, you know, as position markers, and someone artistically get the right screws and plan all that properly next time. I do plan on making some more guitars out of acrylic because I salvaged some big pieces of 1-inch thick tabletops that were from a TV network that's nearby. And I'm going to use those to make bodies. I don't know if I'll do the neck again. It doesn't seem worth it. I'll probably do the necks out of wood. This one was a super great learning experience, and I want to thank Vectric very much for sponsoring this video for me. And I have another video coming out for Vectric very soon where I do the same type of 3D two-sided modeling, but it's on a much smaller project. And I also want to thank Tools Today very much for supplying the bits that I use to do all of this cutting, because cutting acrylic, a nice clean sharp bit, is essential. I'll see you around the interweb. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask, and I'll do my best to answer them. All right, thanks a lot, and be good. I didn't really point this out in the video, but this was hand-selected tone acrylic, deep from the acrylic jungles of Peru.